The battle did not end with the final clash of steel. It ended with silence. Smoke drifted across the field as the cries of the wounded faded into the cold northern wind. Broken shields lay scattered in the mud, and ravens circled overhead, drawn to the aftermath of violence. For the defeated, the nightmare was over. For the victors, it was only beginning. The Vikings did not erupt into mindless celebration, nor did they descend immediately into chaos. They moved with purpose. The same discipline that had held their shield wall firm now guided their steps across the blood-soaked earth. Every fallen enemy, every discarded weapon, every surviving captive had value. What followed was not random brutality, but a calculated process shaped by strategy, belief, and reputation. Across Europe, chroniclers would later describe these northern warriors as demons unleashed upon Christian lands. Yet those who survived their victories understood something more unsettling: the Vikings were methodical. They knew exactly what they were doing after the fighting stopped. And in many ways, what came after the battle was far more shocking than the battle itself. Victory on a medieval battlefield was fragile. A force that celebrated too soon could be struck down by a counterattack, and the Vikings understood this better than most. As the last pockets of resistance collapsed, their first priority was not plunder, but control. Small groups moved across the field to ensure no enemy warriors were regrouping. The wounded who could still fight were disarmed. Strategic positions, bridges, gates, river crossings, were secured immediately. The discipline that had defined their shield wall now revealed itself again in the aftermath. There was no reckless scattering. Orders were given, and they were followed. Weapons and armor were gathered with efficiency. Iron was valuable, and a defeated enemy's sword might serve its new owner in the next clash. Horses were seized, supplies counted, and food stores identified. This was not chaos, it was logistics. A Viking victory had to sustain the war band beyond the moment. The great heathen army, which captured York in 866, did not simply win and depart. After defeating rival Northumbrian rulers, they consolidated power within the city's defenses. Control of territory mattered more than spectacle. Captured nobles were separated from common soldiers. High-status prisoners represented leverage. Some would be ransomed back to their families for silver. Others might be used to negotiate submission from surrounding regions. In a fragmented political landscape like Anglo-Saxon England, holding a single influential figure could alter the balance of power. Killing every opponent was rarely as useful as controlling them. At the same time, a message had to be sent. The Vikings were careful to demonstrate that resistance carried consequences. Strategic brutality, swift, visible, unforgettable, served a purpose. Word would travel faster than their ships. Nearby settlements, hearing of a decisive defeat and disciplined occupation, might choose negotiation over defiance. This psychological edge reduced the need for future bloodshed. Speed remained essential. Victorious warbands did not linger aimlessly. If the goal was silver, captives, or political advantage, it had to be secured before regional armies could unite in response. Europe's kingdoms were divided, but they were not powerless. The Vikings exploited that division by acting before unity could form. What shocked many contemporaries was not merely what the Vikings did after winning, but how organized they were in doing it. They did not behave like scattered raiders intoxicated by victory. They behaved like commanders executing the next phase of a campaign. And in that controlled efficiency lay the true power of their conquests. Once the field was secured and order restored among their own ranks, attention turned to the defeated. Not all enemies were treated the same. For the Vikings, survival and strength mattered more than blind slaughter. Common soldiers who posed no further threat might be disarmed and left behind, but high-ranking nobles were another matter entirely. A captured earl or king was not merely a prisoner, he was a bargaining tool. In a world fractured by rivalries, a single noble in chains could be worth more alive than dead. Ransom was a well-understood system across medieval Europe, and the Vikings used it expertly. Silver flowed in exchange for freedom, and silver fueled further campaigns. Yet mercy was never guaranteed. Those who had resisted fiercely or symbolized political opposition could face execution. In some cases, deaths were public and deliberate, meant to echo far beyond the battlefield. Stories preserved in later sagas speak of harsh punishments inflicted on defeated rulers, including the infamous Blood Eagle, though historians debate how literal such accounts truly are. Whether fully enacted or amplified through storytelling, the effect was powerful. The message was unmistakable: defiance carried consequences. Hostages were another strategic tool. Young nobles or family members of regional leaders might be taken to ensure compliance. As long as the hostage remained in Viking custody, rebellion became a dangerous gamble. This tactic was not unique to the Norse, but they employed it effectively, particularly during campaigns in England in the late 9th century. Ivar the Boneless, whose name appears in Anglo-Saxon chronicles, understood that fear combined with leverage could control entire regions without constant warfare. But there was another path for the defeated: recruitment. Skilled fighters who proved their worth might be offered a place within the warband. Loyalty could be reshaped if survival demanded it. In this way, former enemies sometimes became allies, bound not by shared origin but by shared opportunity. What unsettled Europe was not just the violence, but the calculation behind it. The Vikings did not act randomly in victory. They assessed, categorized, and decided based on advantage. Execution, ransom, hostage-taking, or recruitment, each choice served a purpose. And in that cold evaluation of power and profit, victory became something far more enduring than a single day's triumph. After the prisoners were sorted and resistance extinguished, the true machinery of Viking victory began to turn: the gathering of wealth. Silver was the lifeblood of expansion. Churches and monasteries, often poorly defended yet richly adorned with chalices, reliquaries, and coin, were prime targets not simply because they were symbols of Christian authority, but because they concentrated portable treasure. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 and later the sack of Paris in 845 revealed a pattern that would define the Viking Age: strike hard, extract wealth, and convert success into momentum. But the looting was rarely chaotic. Items were collected systematically. Precious metals were weighed, divided, and distributed according to rank and contribution, reinforcing loyalty within the warband. Beyond silver, people themselves became part of the spoils. Enslavement was a grim reality of early medieval warfare across Europe, and the Vikings participated in it extensively. Captives taken in Britain, Ireland, and Francia were transported across the North Sea or sold in thriving slave markets such as Dublin and Hedeby. From there, trade networks extended as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. Human lives were transformed into economic assets, exchanged for silver, silk, weapons, and political advantage. This trade helped fund further expeditions, creating a cycle in which each victory financed the next. Livestock, grain stores, and tools were also seized. Armies could not survive on silver alone. Sustained campaigns required food and mobility. Horses taken after a victory could transform a raiding force into a fast-moving inland threat. As seen when Viking forces acquired mounts in East Anglia during the campaigns of the Great Heathen Army in the 860s. Wealth was measured not just in coin, but in resources that strengthened operational capacity. Sometimes, the greatest profit came not from plunder but from negotiation. Danegeld payments in England demonstrated that fear could generate tribute without further destruction. When rulers chose to buy peace, they acknowledged the Vikings' ability to inflict damage, and their willingness to do so again. What shocked observers was the scale and integration of this system. Victory was not an isolated event, it fed into a broader economic network linking Scandinavia to distant empires. The Vikings were not merely raiders driven by impulse. They were participants in a vast commercial web, turning battlefield success into sustained power through calculation, trade, and relentless expansion. Not every victory ended with departure. In many cases, the most surprising transformation began after the plunder was counted and the dead were buried. Instead of returning home with their spoils, some Viking leaders chose to stay. Overwintering in enemy territory marked a dramatic shift from seasonal raiding to long-term ambition. Temporary camps became fortified bases, and fortified bases evolved into centers of power. The Great Heathen Army, which arrived in England in 865, demonstrated this new model with striking clarity. After capturing York in 866, they did not simply strip the city and vanish. They occupied it, manipulated rival Northumbrian claimants, and embedded themselves within its political structure. This pattern repeated elsewhere. In eastern and northern England, large areas gradually came under Scandinavian influence, forming what would later be known as the Danelaw. Here, Norse customs and legal practices shaped local governance. Land was redistributed, settlements expanded, and trade routes secured. What had begun as violent conquest transitioned into structured administration. Warriors who once measured success in silver began measuring it in territory and tribute. The same evolution occurred across the Channel. In 911, a Viking leader known as Rollo accepted land from the Frankish king Charles the Simple in what became Normandy. Rather than fight endlessly, both sides negotiated stability. Rollo pledged loyalty, converted to Christianity, and established a ruling dynasty that would later reshape England itself. Conquerors became nobles. Raiders became rulers. Holding territory required discipline equal to winning it. Fortifications were reinforced, supply lines maintained, and alliances negotiated. Viking leaders learned that fear alone could not sustain power indefinitely. Stability required integration. Intermarriage between Scandinavians and local populations blurred cultural boundaries. Norse place names appeared across the English countryside, evidence of settlement rather than temporary occupation. What startled Europe was not simply that the Vikings could win battles, but that they could govern afterward. They were not trapped in endless cycles of destruction. They adapted. Victory became the foundation for permanence. Instead of returning north each season, they carved out domains within the lands they had conquered. This transformation altered the trajectory of medieval Europe. The Vikings were no longer merely external threats striking from the sea. They became part of the political fabric of the continent. And in doing so, they proved that what followed their victories could be more consequential than the battles themselves. When the spoils were secured and the political arrangement settled, another layer of meaning shaped the aftermath of victory. For the Vikings, war was not merely a contest of strength but a realm watched by the gods. Success on the battlefield was interpreted as a sign of favor, and favor demanded acknowledgement. In the fading light after combat, rituals could follow, quiet, solemn, and bound by belief. The Norse world was steeped in a spiritual framework where Odin, the god associated with wisdom, war, and sacrifice, loomed large over the fate of warriors. To win was not only to outfight an enemy, but to have been chosen. The dead of their own ranks were not abandoned carelessly. Burial customs varied depending on wealth and status. Some warriors were interred with weapons, tools, and personal belongings, prepared for what they believed awaited them beyond death. Others were laid to rest in ship burials or beneath mounds, markers of honor and remembrance. The belief in Valhalla, the great hall where fallen warriors would feast and prepare for Ragnarok, gave meaning to sacrifice. Victory did not erase grief, but it reframed it. Those who fell bravely were not lost, they were elevated. There are accounts, some from later chroniclers, describing sacrifices offered in gratitude for triumph. At places like Uppsala in Sweden, medieval writers recorded rituals dedicated to securing divine blessing. While the exact details remain debated among historians, it is clear that religion and warfare were intertwined. The line between ritual and strategy was thin. Acts performed after battle reinforced cohesion within the warband. They reminded every survivor that their strength was not solely their own, but part of a cosmic order in which gods rewarded courage and resolve. Even the handling of enemies could carry spiritual undertones. Dedication of victory to Odin, whose symbols included ravens and eagles circling above battlefields, blurred the boundary between myth and reality. Whether fully literal or shaped by storytelling, such imagery intensified the aura surrounding Viking success. What unsettled their adversaries was not only the violence, but the conviction behind it. These were men who believed their victories were woven into fate itself. In honoring their gods after triumph, they reinforced unity, justified sacrifice, and strengthened morale for the next campaign. The battlefield was not simply ground gained, it was sacred proof that the gods had favored them once more. Long after the smoke cleared and the ships disappeared beyond the horizon, the real impact of a Viking victory continued to spread. Survivors carried the story inland, of disciplined shield walls that would not break, of commanders who showed no hesitation, of settlements stripped of wealth in a matter of hours. Monastic scribes recorded events with trembling detail, describing northern warriors as agents of divine punishment. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts shaped perception across Europe. Fear traveled faster than any longship. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 became more than a single attack, it became a warning whispered along coastlines. If a holy monastery could fall, no place was beyond reach. Later, when fleets sailed up the Seine in 845 and forced Charles the Bald to pay a massive ransom to spare Paris, the psychological message was unmistakable. The Vikings did not need to conquer every fortress. They only needed to prove that they could reach them. Once that belief took hold, rulers were forced to reconsider their options. Danegeld payments in England demonstrated the power of reputation. Kings calculated the cost of resistance against the risk of devastation. Paying silver was humiliating, but it preserved lives and infrastructure. The Vikings understood that intimidation could be more efficient than prolonged war. A reputation for ruthless follow-through after victory reduced the number of battles required in the future. Entire regions might surrender or negotiate rather than test the consequences. Public displays of dominance amplified this effect. The treatment of defeated nobles, the visible occupation of cities like York in 866, and the establishment of fortified winter camps signaled permanence. These were not fleeting raiders who would vanish with the season. They could return. They could stay. And they could reshape political landscapes. This psychological pressure fractured alliances. Rival kingdoms hesitated to commit fully to resistance if they feared isolation. Doubt crept into councils and war rooms. The Vikings exploited division, knowing that uncertainty weakened unity. What shocked Europe most was not simply the violence, but the strategic layering behind it. Victory was never an isolated event. It was part of a broader campaign of influence that extended beyond the battlefield. By turning triumph into legend and legend into leverage, the Vikings ensured that even in absence, their presence lingered. And in that lingering fear lay one of their greatest weapons. Over time, the shock began to fade, not because the Vikings had weakened, but because Europe had adapted. Fortified towns rose along vulnerable rivers, militias were reorganized, and kings studied the discipline and mobility that had once overwhelmed them. The same methods that followed Viking victories, swift consolidation, psychological pressure, and strategic settlement, forced their enemies to evolve. In England, Alfred the Great responded after 878 with fortified buzz and a reorganized defense system that limited the advantage of sudden raids. What had once seemed unstoppable was now contested with structure and preparation. Yet the legacy of those victories endured. In regions shaped by the Danelaw, Scandinavian customs blended with Anglo-Saxon law. In Normandy, descendants of Viking settlers would rise to power and reshape England again in 1066. The conquerors who once shocked Europe did not simply disappear, they transformed. What Vikings did after winning battles altered the continent more deeply than the battles themselves. They looted, negotiated, settled, ruled, and redefined power. Victory was never just an ending. It was the beginning of something larger, an era in which raiders became kings and fear became influence. And in that transformation, the true impact of their triumphs was revealed.